Hello, this is David Bernstein, President and CEO of the Jewish Council for Public Affairs. Welcome to this edition of the CRCast, a bi-monthly webcast on Jewish community relations and Jewish advocacy work. Really delighted to have with us a very special guest, a friend and colleague, Ethan Felson. Ethan is the Executive Director of the Israel Action Network, which builds support for Israel and fights delegitimization. Ethan has been a longtime staffer, was many years with the JCPA, also a JCRC director, one of the best in the business. Ethan, I'm so glad you're here. Thanks for being with us.
Thank you, David. Great to be here.
Great. So before we get into the nitty-gritty about mainline Protestants, I'm wondering if you could give us some context here of how they fit into the larger scheme of things in Christianity in the United States. We have other branches of Christianity as well. What are they, and where do mainline Protestants fit in?
Okay, so that's there are over 2 billion Catholics in the world. It's a 3-day course. And we've got 15, 17 million Jews and lots of stripes and colors, and there's a great diversity. Probably the most significant split happens around 1,000 years ago, where we end up with the Catholic Church in Rome and the Eastern Orthodox churches, which are often Eastern Europe and across that part of the world. Here in the U.S., we tend to look more at the divide between Catholics and Protestants. We're more familiar with that. And among Protestants, we tend to look at it as the mainline and evangelical. It's not good categories, actually, because as I think you probably reviewed on your other webinar, evangelical doesn't refer to specific denominations. It's belief set, an activist, biblicist, cruciacentric view on the world, and a born-again conversionary experience. Those are the evangelicals. The mainline are a set of churches. They're evangelicals in the mainline. Even the mainline are members of the National Council of Churches. They're not members of the National Association of Evangelicals. The things to know about the mainline is United Methodist Church is the largest of them. It's a global denomination, 12 million United Methodists in the world, about 7 million here in the United States. The Evangelical Lutheran Church in America, which is in the mainline, is not considered an evangelical church. The Episcopal Church, the Presbyterian Church USA, and the United Church of Christ. The important things to understand, these are churches that tend to be more on the progressive end of the spectrum politically and theologically. This is increasingly so, as a lot of conservatives and evangelicals who are in these denominations have left over a set of issues, most recently over the ordination of lesbian and gay clergy. All but the United Methodist Church ordain openly gay clergy. With that vote, or with that decision, a large set of evangelicals have walked out of each of these denominations. Another thing to note is they're on the decline numerically. They were the power elite in America. The Presbyterian Church, when we started dealing with the divestment issue, which we're going to talk about, there were 2.6 million of them. Today, there are 1.3 million. They're still very important. There are a lot of thriving churches at the local level, and I think another thing to know about the mainline is they really are very much rooted in the American story. These are churches that place a high emphasis on democratic process within their denominations, and some of the very systems of governance in the United States find parallels in these mainline Protestant churches.
So we go way back, and I remember you originally in 2004 when the Presbyterian Church USA announced it was going to be investigating divestment from Israel. And this was a shock to the system, and many of us first actually engaged mainlines during that time. And you were certainly at the forefront then, and I saw you at church conventions and really leading the troops on this. You've been doing this now for 14 years at least. Maybe you were doing it before then. How have these churches evolved since then in their attitudes toward Israel? Are we seeing the same thing we saw in 2004 when we saw that first divestment resolution, or has the conversation changed in any significant way?
It's evolved a lot. So our first touch to a lot of this was actually 3 years earlier, in 2001, when the United Nations has their World Conference Against Racism in Durban, South Africa, and we saw the World Council of Churches backing resolutions to say that Zionism is a form of racism and opposing a move that would have said that anti-Semitism is a form of racism. And our friends who we worked with on a lot of issues domestically in these mainline Protestant churches, they were on the other side at this really painful movement. That's where the BDS movement gets rolled out. So that's our first connection to it. And then a lot happened in between, right? The week after the Durban conference was 9/11 and Homeland Security and wars and all that. And then all of a sudden in 2004, our eyes were away. The Presbyterian Church took that first step toward divestment. Around that time, all of the churches were bunched together. We spoke to all of the different mainline churches. They were all investigating this. Some had actually started calling companies. And over the course of the last 14 years, they've really spread out again. The thing that they share in common is a strong attachment to Palestinian narrative. That's a common denominator. Churches like the Episcopal Church really work hard to find a way to speak to that Palestinian imperative in ways that are not anti-Israel, not anti-Jewish, not anti-Semitic. That's very important to them. In the Presbyterian Church, they all too often veer in the other direction and will resort to tropes and motifs that are very triggering to us and fairly careless in terms of anti-Semitism, and all too often they are moving an anti-Zionist agenda these days.
We're aware, by the way, that there might be some sound issues. We're working on them to try to resolve them as quickly as possible. But I want to ask you a little bit more about that. Hopefully sound's getting better. By the way, we'll invite you to ask some questions at any time. We can see the questions. We'd love to pose them to Ethan. So where did this identification with the Palestinian narrative come from? You spoke of it, and you said it exists in all these churches. Why do they care about Palestinians per se?
There are a couple of different reasons why it is such an important issue. First of all, that is where Jesus lived, died, had his ministry in between, where the biblical stories are grounded. They have a strong attachment to Palestinian Christians. Palestinian Christians are not part of the Zionist narrative. I would say also because of the strong connection of evangelical Christians to Zionism, to Israel. These mainline Protestants stand in a very different place on a whole set of issues from evangelical Christians and Christian Zionists, and so that plays into the drama.
So fast forward to 14 years, and we had another round of conventions this summer. I know you were very active on this. Where is the Israel agenda today in these churches? Was divestment approved? If so, where, how? Where are we now?
Okay, so there were two church conventions this summer. The Presbyterians met in St. Louis, the Episcopalians met in Austin, but all the denominations have met in the last 2 years. And at the Presbyterian convention, remember, they voted to sell shares in 3 companies a couple of years ago. They did not endorse the BDS movement at that time. There's some who would love them to do that. It hasn't happened. They, at this past convention, adopted a resolution embracing people-to-people programs between Israelis and Palestinians. And
that's constructive.
Very constructive, and against the the strong opposition of BDS groups, which see these people-to-people programs, which we find to be very hopeful and necessary for peace building. They favor anti-normalization. They want to put walls up, and the denomination rejected that overwhelmingly. And so we thought that that was a very positive sign within the denomination, where we don't find too many positive signs. They adopted a resolution opposing anti-BDS legislation. They were critical of the move of the embassy to Jerusalem. They were critical of Israeli policy in Gaza, but they did reject some of the worst policies put before them. There was one on Christian-Jewish relations that would have been made a mockery of what we try to do at the local level. And there's another resolution from some anti-Zionist Palestinian Christians embracing one of their letters. They rejected that. At the Episcopal Church, they're bicameral. So there's a House of Bishops and a House of Deputies. The House of Deputies looked at a lot of resolutions and passed quite a few, including one that would have favored BDS. The House of Bishops rejected that. In the end, they passed a resolution that called for a committee to come up with criteria to implement a human rights screen based on church policies. They also had a resolution criticizing the move of the embassy to Jerusalem. There's some messages in that because that was very much seen as a move of a particular U.S. administration that was unpopular with the people in this denomination. In both denominations, the United Methodists have consistently rejected divestment resolutions. The Lutherans have an investment screen in place, but also have rejected divestment, and the United Church of Christ is closer to where the Presbyterians are.
Yeah. So some say that this criticism of Israel, these resolutions that are rooted in deep animus toward Jews and anti-Semitism. Is that your view? If so, how much so?
I think the first and most important thing to know is that the vast majority of people who are in these denominations want what's best for Israelis. They want what's best for Palestinians. They want positive relationships with the Jews, the Jewish community. They want positive relationship with the Muslim community, and they're striving to find a way to do that. There are, however, people who are activists, and particularly in the Presbyterian Church, people who are in leadership who don't have that same set of values and who too often are listening to Jews who reject Zionism or don't embrace Zionism, who give them permission to go in directions that the others don't want to go. And so we find, again, people spread out across a wide range, but I think at the local level, the people that folks in the Jewish community, that JCRCs, that rabbis are dealing with at the local level, they're really searching. And I think they need our engagement to help them continue to find ways to be both and.
Right. And so even if we see examples of animus coming from a particular church, we shouldn't assume it's widely shared in the pews. We should assume that there's an opportunity to engage people who might not be anywhere way share that sentiment.
Right, and just as the Jewish community had a lot of mythology about evangelical Christians,
right,
and only by being in conversation are we realizing, wow, that's a very, very diverse constituency, and they are learning from us, we are learning from them. We don't walk away from the mainline Protestants. There are people who are searching, wanting to do the right thing, and often led by some people who don't want to do the right thing, and we have to help them understand the distinctions.
Right. So what are some of the animating theologies and philosophies of mainline Protestants? We've heard the word liberation theology thrown around a lot. What is it, and how does it influence the discourse coming from the church?
So liberation theology posits that God has a preference for the poor, for the weak, the downtrodden. And even if somebody does not consider themselves strongly attached to liberation theology, you can't understand what's happening in the mainline without understanding the role of power. And but for many Jews, justice, we see justice as doing the right thing morally and ethically. For them, they see justice quite often as alleviating the suffering of the weak. That's an important thing to understand because as they view Israel, Israel equals power, and right, Palestinians equal powerless.
Power is inherently corrupt, and
right,
victimization is inherently virtuous.
Exactly, and Israel is viewed as attached to a military, and we may view Palestinians as part of a larger Arab world. We may view Palestinians as people who have all too often resorted to terror. The Palestinians that they meet quite often are Palestinian Christians who speak of nonviolence, and so we just have different understandings of the complicated and multiple narratives in the land.
How do we engage in that conversation with people who might share that idea of power? What is that like, and how do we influence it, if we should even influence it?
I think we need to influence it. To walk away is a terrible mistake. They're too often being given a caricature
right,
of an Israeli. So if you take a look at the materials that come out of the Presbyterian Church, Israel is the bulldozer, and Palestinians are the pile of rubble. They don't hear from rank and file Israelis. They don't know the degree to which Israelis are searching to do the right thing. They don't hear the difficult decisions Israelis are forced to make to defend themselves. They don't hear the story of Rachel, an Israeli woman who, when the siren goes off and she's bathing her child, has 15 seconds to get to the safe room, her kid covered in soap, and she's worried about her 6-year-old who's playing in the yard next door. They hear the story of Fatima, a Palestinian girl who may be suffering in difficult circumstances. And so I think part of our job is to help them to understand the people of the land, to meet the people of the land, to go there and not to have the conflict reduced to a caricature of right and wrong, good and evil, which is the way it is too often being portrayed.
Yeah, to complicate the picture, right? And because they're clearly, it's not to bring them where we are necessarily. It's to, or some of us are. It's to say that this is more complicated than you might imagine. Listen to all the voices. And you mentioned that, to bring them to the land. I know that you've led trips. What role do trips play in this? Do you bring rank and file pastors, or who do you bring to Israel and why? How's it work?
We bring all different kinds of groups. One of the things that we recognize is, it's all politics is local. And at the local level, there are a lot of ministers, a lot of lay people who want to hear more and recognize that they're only hearing one thing. We've created a project called Interfaith Partners for Peace, which pairs rabbis and ministers at the local level. Quite often we're traveling, we're meeting with Israelis and Palestinians, we're meeting with Israelis and Palestinians working together in people-to-people programs, and when they hear about the work that happens in Kids for Peace, which brings Israeli and Palestinian kids together, people recognize that there's something that they can do that will further peace. When they hear about settlers getting together with neighboring Palestinian villagers and programs that bring people together around health, around education, and a whole range of other ways that folks can interact. And we recognize that in North Ireland and other areas of conflict, it's the people-to-people programs that help provide the infrastructure for a more peaceful future. We want to present to people that there's something that they can do to lift up rather than tear down.
Right. And if they've been told by somebody that the only way for them to influence the current situation on the ground is to divest, they'll do it. But if they've been told, shown that there might be another way for them to more constructively engage and influence the company, they may do that as well. And that's what we're hoping to show them.
Right, and that there are many, many people across the spectrum who share their values of peace and justice, who recognize that the way to move there is not through tearing down and divestment, but finding ways for people to get along, to learn from one another, to learn conflict resolution and other skills that can take us in the right direction. And the BDS movement, which has embraced anti-normalization, would move in a different direction.
So there's a school of thought that I hear sometimes in the Jewish pro-Israel community that this is a big waste of time. We're losing, they're shrinking in numbers. We may be shrinking in numbers as well, but they're shrinking in numbers. We've got bigger fish to fry. Either that it won't work no matter what you do, or there are better things to do than this. Help me out there. What's your response to that?
Yeah, I mean, I don't think these are our choices. I don't think it is true. Numerically, they're in significant decline. They're not as politically influential as they were. We can walk and chew gum at the same time. We can be engaged on campus and with churches on the left and churches on the right and municipalities and all the different spheres where these conversations emerge. It would be a huge mistake where there are conversations emerging in which people are saying things that are very hostile to our values, to Jews, to Israel, to Zionism, and to just leave that conversation to those who would take it in a far different direction. We have, as it were, a dog in this fight, and we have friends who want to do the right thing, and they need our support as well.
So this is, it seems to me, both a national issue and a local issue. It's both national work and local work. To what degree is it local work, and what can local communities do in order to advance the discussion with mainline Protestants?
Pick up the phone. People need to pick up the phone. You need to have relationships. In almost all of the situations where there has been some major transformation, you can track it down to a relationship. A rabbi knows a pastor, a student senator knows another student senator. And so in community relations, we know it starts with the relationship. A lot of rabbis sit on interfaith councils. We know that where they engage their colleagues and have difficult conversations, there are breakthroughs. And it doesn't mean that somebody stands with us on every set of issues or stands with the Israeli government on every set of issues, but we can help people to understand how to engage this in ways that don't veer in the direction of anti-Semitism, anti-Zionism, but towards pathways that build peace and build a more positive future.
So we get one question. What happens if there's an Israeli government policy that that is sort of playing into a more hostile view to Israel? Maybe something that you or I might even question or object to. How do we talk about that with mainline Protestants who may be coming into the conversation in a very critical mindset?
Yeah, I don't think any of this work is about backing the policy of the Palestinian Authority or the Israeli government. We can help to interpret because we have a lot of relationships with Israelis, and we can help people to understand why Israelis feel the way they do about a set of issues, but where we disagree with an Israeli policy. We can help people to understand why we disagree, and yet we still agree with Israel that there should be a Jewish state, and to help people understand those complexities and how sometimes these issues are interpreted within the churches in ways that aren't truthful. We just saw the leader of one of the large umbrella groups in the church tell a story in a letter about something that happened a few years ago that had a falsehood in it. It just made Israel look very, very bad. They said that soldiers defecated in this church. We looked at all the reports of what happened at the time, and there are no reports of that happening. We saw that happen with an Episcopal bishop who said when she was there, she saw the Israelis shoot a Palestinian kid in the back 7 times. And there are no reports of that at the time. She said she saw a Palestinian kid knock a ball over the side of the Temple Mount, and the Israelis went to arrest that kid and put handcuffs on a 3-year-old or something, and it wasn't true. That couldn't physically happen. So sometimes people get caught up in the moment. They want to tell stories that they've heard that aren't truthful, that we need to be engaged to say, this happened, this didn't happen, this policy you're interpreting in a way that isn't grounded in reality.
One thing that you said made me think of another question, which is, to what degree do we see the denial of Israel's right to exist as a Jewish state in this discussion? Is that core to this? Are the critics that we're up against, are these people who generally oppose Israel's right to exist as a Jewish state, or are they just simply critics?
We can't paint them all with one broad brush. There are many, many of the activists who think that Israel doesn't have a right to exist as a Jewish state, who would favor right of return, who would say that the Zionist project is illegitimate and colonial. The Presbyterian Church has put forward a couple of documents that go to make that claim, and a document, Zionism Unsettled, that is a fairly anti-Jewish trope. That being said, the Presbyterian Church, when faced with this issue, they backed a resolution the leadership didn't love, but it said that the church would oppose any effort to undermine the right of the Jewish people to self-determination, which the right of the Jewish people to self-determination, that's Zionism. So when push comes to shove, the people across the church, they want to do the right thing. They want to lift up both parts of this.
We have another question. Is there an equivalent of Snopes to handle phony stories quickly and accurately? Maybe that would go beyond just the engagement with mainlines.
I think we have a lot of versions of that, and I think Google can take you there, and we're always happy to field questions from people. There are a lot of us who follow what's happening in churches and campus and labor very close, and so pick up the phone and call us, email us. We're happy to help.
Still an intriguing idea. How does the community deal with a Presbyterian church or another church, presumably, bringing in a rabbi from Jewish Voices for Peace? Jewish JVP is a group that's highly critical, if not opposed to Israel's right to exist as a Jewish state. How do we deal with that?
I think we try to help them understand that if they want a relationship with the Jewish community, come to the Jewish community. We have lots and lots of rabbis who represent a range of views, but that sit with the mainstream community, and we want to be in partnership. And also perhaps to help them understand that they don't appreciate it when somebody goes and cherry pick somebody in another community that isn't authentic, and this is a version of doing the same thing.
Last question, I think. Are there other ways that we can find common ground with mainlines that may or may not help the conversation around Israel?
Well, these are our friends, they're our neighbors. We should be in relationship with them on social justice, the environment, and a whole range of matters. If I'm understanding your question, that yeah, we need to know them as they know themselves, and there are some issues where we're going to have a difference of opinion. It's not healthy to ignore them. For years we said, let's just have an interfaith Seder, let's just work on these issues and leave that for another day. I think we want to meet people fully where they are, work with those who we can work with. And we've done that with the Catholic Church for years. We disagree with them on this set of issues, and we agree with them on this set of issues. We do that with evangelical Christians and mainline Protestants all the time, and it's healthy.
Ethan, first of all, thank you for all the work that you do in this arena. It's great to know that you're doing it, that somebody really has this portfolio and makes sure that it's done so well on our behalf. I appreciate that. We appreciate that. And thank you for coming and spending time with us. We really appreciate it.
Thank you. We couldn't do it without the JCPA and the Community Relations Councils and your tremendous leadership.
Thanks very much. If you have any ideas for future CRcasts, please email them to events@thejcpa.org. We're really looking forward to ideas, events@thejcpa.org. And stay tuned for our next few episodes, which we'll be advertising shortly. Thanks very much, and take care.